You know, I always wondered what it would be like if Shockwave just gave up trying to care about logic and instead just wanted to shoot someone in the face. From Transformers Energon, this is Shockblast, the first redo of Shockwave after G1, and when this guy came out, it was a massive deal. It was the first time that a massive fan favorite from G1 was giving a new toy. Sure, he was Shockblast instead of Shockwave, and yes, the design is very different, but there's still the soul of the old boy in here, from the mono eye to the sharp head design to the massive gun arm, and yet it's still unique and beautiful in its own thing. And we're not going to get into the characters here, but even the whole idea that this was Shockwave was really turned on its head in the Energon cartoon, because instead of playing him up as a particularly smart character or as someone who was a slave to logic, this Shockwave was really just more focused on the idea that Shockwave was a sadist. He liked to hurt people, and he wanted to take over the Decepticons. In some ways, he was actually kind of dumb, but that single-minded dedication to trying to hurt others kind of became the guiding light of Shockwave, and I go so far as to say it probably has helped us get a better understanding as to how to write a character like this. Just looking at this guy with broad strokes, I think it is a great look for a Transformer. It is still very much Shockwave of old, but I love the color scheme here, the introduction of this kind of off-white, almost beige color, and the neon green. I also love his big green monster arm. It does get a little bit unruly, as you can probably tell he is very, very asymmetric, and a lot of the weight here does kind of drag him down a bit, but it does make for a very cool design. I also like the idea that Shockwave would have guns on the other arm as well. I don't think it would work for a scientist Shockwave, but again, for a Shockwave that's supposed to just be more of a sadistic warlord, this works great. A good design choice. Speaking of good design choices, look at the head on this figure. This might honestly be my favorite head sculpt for Shockwave ever. I love how long it is. It almost looks more like his head is a camera now instead of him just being a Cyclops. And you can even pose the ears somewhat, having them go back and forth. You have a great ball joint in the head, and the neon green eye is striking. If you were to line up a lot of Shockwaves on a shelf together, this is one that would immediately jump out at you just due to how different, and yet still correct, it looks. It's a wonderful evolution of the Shockwave design. Articulation, admittedly, is somewhat hit or miss. You have a great swivel neck as well as a ball joint in the head. You work these two joints in tandem, you get so many good looks out of Shockwave, so much emotion out of an emotionless head. You have a good universal ratchet joint. Listen to that ratchet too. Very loud. You have an upper arm cut, a double jointed elbow on this side, and you can even articulate the thumb. Here on the gun arm, you still have the universal, but nothing else except for a little flap down here that can approximate a thumb. You have a waist swivel that's also ratcheted. Apologies, you might have noticed the kibble just fell down. And you also have an ab crunch due to transformation. Get so many wonderful poses out of that. Now, the back kibble does get loose a lot. Be aware of that, but it does just click back into place. You have a good ratchet down here, soft ratchet for the hip, and a ratchet back and forth, and a heavy ratchet for the knee, as well as an upper leg cut, and a swiveled ball joint down here for the foot, and the toe does collapse. This is one of the more articulated figures out of Energon, and honestly, one of the more articulated figures of Shockwave in general. The big gun arm does weigh him down. It's hard to use that wonderful articulation because he often gets off balance. But at the same time, that big gun arm is kind of what's informing the rest of his major character design overhaul, so I'm not going to hold it against him that much. Speaking of the gun arm, it probably is the single most different element of this Shockblast as opposed to a normal Shockwave, but there is a gimmick here. So this little black nub here is actually a switch. Take it down. Yeah. That just sent a missile flying. Usually that's just a noise, but this time sounds happened, and also... Oh, that's really unfortunate. That's really unfortunate. Oh no, the figure just broke on camera. Okay, that popped back into place. I'll glue it later. But yeah, basically what's supposed to happen is you take it here, and it's ready to fire, and you also got this noise. You fire it again, and that's when it actually fires. Before I filmed this, it was working great. Keep in mind, this figure's 20 years old at this point, So I guess we've just kind of worn it down over time. That's a shame. I can glue that back into place. I still have the missile, and the missile doesn't go all that far. Admittedly, it's kind of a overstated gimmick. That said, I do love the fact that so much pops up from the gun arm. You have these great gold panels that pop out, as well as the neon green claws that also jut out. It's a cool transformation. I am really sad that it just broke like that. I keep saying broke. It didn't break. It's just, there's going to be a little bit of tender loving care needed for this Shockwave now. It's okay. Just as many people have said about Shockwave over the years, I can fix him. Pulling in some old friends in my very rapidly growing Shockwave collection, I can pretty confidently say that Energon Shockblast isn't my new favorite or anything. I think Alternators and Prime Shockwave are both figures I still prefer over this one. But at the same time, looking at the rest of my collection, there's not many Shockwaves I can honestly say I like as much as this guy. I think he's better than the red Shockwave. I think he's better than some of the other Shockwaves I've been able to get my grubby little hands on as of late. It's a great toy and a great looking figure. I hate that we had that mishap again, but that doesn't take away from my enjoyment of the Shockwave at all. And even if that gun was completely broken, the aesthetics of the figure is still incredibly strong, and does make it a standout Shockwave. There's not another version of the character that's ever going to look like this, and I do think that putting him alongside my two other favorite Shockwaves, it kind of makes me want to just do a Shockwave shelf, if I'm going to be honest with you. Also, he looks great with Predacon. Good to know. So I am hopelessly enamored with the unique stylings of this Shockblast. My only question now is, how does the vehicle mode look? Transforming this guy is very quick and efficient, but it's also a ton of fun. There's so many great lock-in points. And even though you can look at this robot, or this vehicle, and really figure out where the pieces went, those are the legs, head, chest, arm, it's also just a good transformation. Everything pegs in well and it rolls incredibly well. Also, yeah, this is a funky looking tank. It looks more like a train, but I really like it. Also, I had to expose the fact that, yeah, I don't know everything about Transformers. I always thought that animated Shockwave was the first time Shockwave turned into a tank. But no, it was Energon. Energon was the first one to turn him into a space tank. That's so cool. I feel like that's an awesome thing that no one talks about. And it doesn't, like, also change the fact that the more I interact with this Shockblast, I'm starting to realize, like, animated Shockwave, he's taken design inspirations from a lot of things, right? He's taken some from G1 Shockwave, he's taken a lot from Armada Megatron, but the proportions and the tank mode, and even some of the transformation, it's coming from this guy. Animated Shockwave, one of the greatest toys of all time, and I can see the cornerstone, the beginning of the DNA strand forming right here. How wild is that? That's what I love about messing with these older Transformer toys, especially from the Unicron trilogy, is just the fact that I feel like we've forgotten how much these toys would have inspired the things to follow them. And to be sure, there's not much you can do in the tank. You can actually use the waist joint to move the turret around, which is awesome. You can also go up and down. That's it, I'm sure you just know something. The tank can't support its own weight because of how big that gun arm is. But even still, just a really cool space tank. I love how this looks. Is it going to be for everyone? No, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be really put off by just how little this guy transforms. But for them, maybe they'll prefer the third mode. Look at this tower of power. Now this guy is not fully transformed into the third mode. We're going to talk about why in a minute. But what this is supposed to be is just a massive cannon emplacement. And all of those gold plates that we saw on the gun before, here, let's do it. Yep, you can see that little gold piece that fell off. It is for this mode. That's the reason why these solars are here. This whole thing is supposed to be taking in solar energy to power up the weapons. Now, what is supposed to happen is these pieces here are supposed to fully come out and then form the floor. Here's the thing. I can't get them to go all the way down. I've tried pulling at them. I'm starting to see stress marks in the plastic, so I can't get these pieces to fully extend. So this should be here. I can't get it past here. What I'm assuming, this guy is very old at this point, you know, like I said, 20 years old at this point. Whoever owned this toy, I don't think ever transformed it, because I also had a really hard time getting the toes collapsed or these panels folded up. I think this is one of those cases where someone had this toy for a long time, kept them in robot mode, and as an extent, some of these more fragile pieces of the figure have become incredibly stiff with age. So I'll never be able to fully transform this guy without doing a little bit of surgery. But even without that, I really like this. I'm usually not a big fan of base modes, but there's so much here that is dedicated to this, like all these panels only flip open for this mode, and it introduces the gold. It's a great third mode, and I like the idea of Shockwave being a stationary cannon. I talked about this in the Prime review. Shockwave is one of the only Transformers where I actually think it's in character for them to not transform all that much. Shockwave wouldn't necessarily want a fast vehicle mode. He'd want a bigger gun. He'd want to be able to transform, shoot, go right back to robot mode, and this is just perfect for him. And even if I can't fully transform it, I actually do still like how this looks. I love the idea that it is just this big cannon pointed up. It almost looks like it's an anti-air, like, artillery piece. But with that, guys, let's get him back into robot mode. You know, I've never seen a Transformers toy line that reeks of being the middle child as much as Energon does. As a cartoon, as a comic, as a toy line, Energon's always the forgotten part of the Unicron trilogy. To hear the popular consensus tell it, it was Armada that kind of reinvigorated the franchise, and then Cybertron was one of the best toy lines ever, and it seems as though we as a fandom just gloss over Energon. Was it a good cartoon? No, and I very much agree it is the weakest of the three Unicron trilogy cartoons. And to some extent, I'll even agree that the toy line might be the weakest of the three. It doesn't have the great aesthetic of Armada, and it doesn't have the engineering brilliance of Cybertron, and yet, the design work here is immaculate. Not every Energon figure is good. Indeed, many of them are actually kind of iffy. But that doesn't change the fact that when they got it right, it was some of the most unique and engaging designs ever. Galvatron, Inferno, Ironhide to a certain extent, and indeed, Shockblast. In a lot of ways, this toy makes me sad. I compare him to his contemporary Prime Shockwave, and a figure I don't own, Animated Shockwave. These three are all somewhat hard to come by right now. For Prime and Animated Shockwave especially, you might be spending a few $100s to get it complete. And even though Energon Shockblast doesn't go for $100, he is going for around $60-70. And the thing that makes me sad is, at the end of the day, the market is going to ensure we're going to get Prime and Animated Shockwaves again. Maybe as an Age of the Prime release, maybe they're going to get re-releases, or maybe there's going to be third-party options. I'm sure an APC Shockwave is on a whiteboard somewhere, and I'm doubly sure that there could be a third-party animated or Prime Shockwave one day, especially as the fans of those series continue to grow older and the demand for those toys becomes even stronger. That type of fervor doesn't exist for Energon. It wasn't many people's jumping on point, and even the people who were there for the Unicron trilogy tend to overlook Energon. The sad fact of the matter is, Prime Shockwave will have an homage, and he'll probably have a second figure one day. Animated Shockwave is the same way. And if you want to get truly particular about this, you could argue that there is a Prime Shockwave on the market right now by way of the Bumblebee movie Shockwave that took a lot of inspiration from this design. Energon Shockblast? That's not going to happen. There's not going to be a guy like him. There's not going to be a Legacy United or Age of the Primes version of him. This is going to be, forever, his only toy, more than likely. In this life, we are brought up believing that if you work hard, you will succeed, and if you take the easy way, you will fail. But that's not how life works. Indeed, no matter how hard you try, there is a chance that you will fail. No matter how much work you put into it, no matter how unique you are, there is every reality that you may not be appreciated in your own time, assuming you ever are appreciated. I know that this is somewhat idiotic to try to apply that to toys. Trust me, these are small potatoes in terms of life. Toys don't ultimately change the quality of life for an individual, aside from the joy that one might get from collecting them. But it is kind of strange that this Energon Shockblast, it's kind of making me have these thoughts. Think of all the amazing designers who must have been working on Transformers Energon, and their designs are somewhat lost to the ether. If they get new versions, it's going to be from Fans Hobby or maybe a core class figure in Legacy United. And even though we know the names of men like Aaron Archer, there were a lot of people who were working on these toys that just kind of go uncredited. What about the animators? What about the voice actors? Sure, you remember Gary Chalk. Do you remember who voiced Energon Shockblast? Because I don't. A lot of work went into this toy. It is a beautiful figure. It is a figure that has issues, yes, but it's also a unique experience in Transformers, something very hard to find, especially nowadays. And it does make for a striking toy. And yet, there's always going to be the sadness of knowing that it's never going to be appreciated. This is my beautiful boy. It's a great Shockwave that I would recommend to anyone. Mostly because we're probably never going to get a guy like him ever again.